There is a sweetener mentioned 50 times in Scripture, a thick, dark, molasses-like syrup that the people of ancient Judea poured over their bread, stirred into their water, and carried in leather pouches across the wilderness. It contains over 20 distinct polyphenols, a glycemic index nearly half that of refined white sugar, and a mineral profile that includes potassium, magnesium, and copper in measurable quantities. Research published in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry in 2013 identified compounds within it that may support healthy blood sugar response and cellular repair. And when the Lord promised his people a land flowing with milk and honey in Exodus 3:8, the Hebrew word for that honey, davash, did not primarily mean what comes from the bee. It meant this: the syrup of the date palm. The assumption that biblical honey always referred to bee honey is one of the most persistent translation shadows in Western Christianity. In the dry hill country around Jericho, around the Dead Sea, across the Jordan Valley, the date palm grew in such abundance that entire cities were named for it. Jericho itself was called the City of Palms. And the ancient Judeans did not just eat the fruit. They boiled it down, reduced it, and transformed it into something extraordinary. A sweet, glossy, deeply flavored syrup called silan in modern Hebrew and davash tamarim in the Old texts. This was the everyday sweetener. Bee honey existed, yes, but it was rarer, seasonal, and often reserved for special occasions. Date syrup was the pantry staple of prophets and kings, the sweetness that fueled the priests in the temple courts and the laborers in the vineyards alike. Here's what's remarkable. When modern nutritional scientists began analyzing date syrup in controlled laboratory conditions, they discovered something the rabbis of the first century could not have articulated but clearly understood through generations of observation. The sugar profile of date syrup is fundamentally different from refined sucrose. It delivers a balanced fructose-glucose ratio, typically around 50-50, bound together with soluble fiber, polyphenolic antioxidants, and trace minerals that slow digestion and modulate the body's insulin response. A study in the journal Nutrients in 2019 reported that date syrup produced a significantly lower postprandial glucose spike compared to an equivalent dose of table sugar in healthy adult volunteers. The researchers attributed this to the presence of soluble fiber, polyphenols, and the natural matrix of the fruit itself. Pay attention to this next part, because it reframes something most of us were taught wrong. We have been told for decades that sugar is sugar, that a calorie is a calorie, that the body cannot distinguish between the fructose in a date and the fructose in a soda can. But the body does distinguish. It distinguishes by context. Isolated fructose, stripped from fiber and stripped from polyphenols, floods the liver and overwhelms its metabolic pathways, contributing to conditions that researchers associate with insulin resistance and fatty liver accumulation. Fructose delivered within a whole food matrix, alongside tannins and flavonoids and potassium and magnesium. That is a different physiological event entirely. The dates of ancient Judea contained that matrix, and when boiled into syrup using traditional low-temperature reduction methods, much of that matrix survives intact, carried forward into the finished product like a whisper of the orchard itself. The compounds inside date syrup that researchers have isolated read like a pharmacology textbook written by a farmer. There are flavonoids, including quercetin and luteolin, both associated in research with anti-inflammatory activity. There are phenolic acids, particularly caffeic acid and ferulic acid, which studies in the British Journal of Nutrition have linked to healthy cardiovascular markers. There are carotenoids, which give the syrup its deep amber color and which may support cellular defense against oxidative stress. There is soluble fiber, which feeds the beneficial bacteria in the colon and produces short-chain fatty acids like butyrate that nourish the intestinal lining. And there are trace minerals like selenium, manganese, and zinc in amounts that, while small, contribute to the body's enzymatic machinery day after day. What they understood intuitively, we now know molecularly. In the markets of first-century Galilee, you could walk past stalls where merchants demonstrated the quality of their date syrup by tilting clay jars and watching the viscosity of the stream. Too thin meant the syrup had been cut with water or under-reduced. Too thick meant overboiling, which caramelizes the sugars and destroys the delicate polyphenols. The ideal was a slow, glossy pour, a syrup that coated the wooden spoon and ran off in a steady, unbroken ribbon. The same test a careful home cook uses today. Jesus himself almost certainly ate this syrup. When he blessed the bread at Bethany, when he shared meals, with the disciples in the upper room, when Proverbs 24:13 advised, "My son, eat thou honey, because it is good," this is very likely the honey being described. The disciples walking the dusty roads between Capernaum and Jerusalem would have carried small clay flasks of it for quick energy, mixing a spoonful into water from wells along the route. Consider the practical preparation. Traditional date syrup is made from the medjool or deglet noor variety, or in more ancient times from the Kadrawi and Barhi dates native to the region. The process begins by washing roughly 1 kilogram of pitted, high-quality dates, then simmering them in about 3 liters of filtered water for somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour at a low temperature, ideally below 95 degrees Celsius. The softened dates are then pressed through a fine muslin cloth, and the liquid is returned to a wide, shallow pan, where it reduces slowly for another hour to 90 minutes, until it reaches a viscosity roughly similar to warm maple syrup. The final product should be a rich mahogany color, glossy and slightly fragrant, with a hint of caramel and molasses. 1 kilogram of dates typically yields about 300 to 400 milliliters of finished syrup. Stored in a sterile glass jar in a cool pantry, authentic date syrup keeps for 12 months or longer without refrigeration, a testament to its natural preservative qualities. The sourcing matters enormously. Commercial date syrups sold in large supermarkets are often produced under industrial heat extraction methods that destroy the polyphenols the ancient Judeans valued without ever knowing their chemical names. Some products are also blended with glucose syrup or high-fructose corn syrup to cut costs, which completely defeats the purpose of choosing date syrup in the first place. The quality indicators to look for are simple. A single ingredient list. Dates. That is it. Traditional cold press or low temperature methods. Organic certification when possible. And a color that is deep, almost opaque brown, rather than thin and translucent. Small producers from Israel, Iraq, Tunisia, and parts of California now produce authentic, minimally processed Ceylon that mirrors what the ancients would have recognized. When you open a jar of properly made date syrup, the aroma should remind you of caramelized figs and warm earth, not of sugary syrup from a squeeze bottle. And here is a detail that often gets missed. Date syrup is not a free pass. It is still concentrated sugar. A tablespoon contains roughly 15 grams of carbohydrate and about 60 calories. The point is not that you can consume it with abandon. The point is that when you do use a sweetener, choosing one with a polyphenol matrix, a balanced sugar profile, and a lower glycemic response may support healthier metabolic outcomes than choosing refined white sugar stripped of everything except sweetness. Research suggests that substituting date syrup for refined sugar in baked goods and beverages in appropriate moderate quantities is associated with improved markers of antioxidant capacity in some study populations. Always discuss dietary changes with your healthcare provider. particularly if you manage diabetes or a related condition. There is a cultural dimension here too that is easy to overlook. When Judges 5:25 describes Jael offering Sisera butter in a lordly dish, that hospitality gesture reflected something central to ancient Near Eastern life: the sharing of rich, concentrated, life-sustaining foods as an act of reverence. Date syrup fit that same social role. It was the sweetness you offered a traveler, the sweetness you drizzled over unleavened bread during the feasts, the sweetness you mixed with tahini to create a paste that the children of Judea carried into the fields as midday fuel. That combination, date syrup and sesame paste, still exists today in the Middle East under the name dibs with tahina, and it is a remarkable demonstration of ancient nutritional wisdom. The protein and healthy fats from sesame slow the absorption of the sugars from the dates, creating a sustained-release energy source that modern sports nutritionists would recognize as a near-perfect fuel profile. It is the original performance food, formulated 2,000 years before the invention of the energy gel. Pay attention to the blood sugar dynamics one more time, because this is the heart of the matter. When researchers at King Saud University conducted a controlled study published around 2011, they tested date syrup against equivalent amounts of glucose and sucrose in adult volunteers and measured blood glucose at 15, 30, 60, 90, and 120 minutes. The date syrup group showed a notably flatter glucose curve, with a lower peak and a more gradual return to baseline. The researchers credited the soluble fiber content, the polyphenol load, and the inherent matrix of the natural product. For anyone working with their healthcare provider to maintain healthy blood sugar balance, this kind of substitution, swapping a tablespoon of refined sugar for a tablespoon of date syrup, may offer meaningful long-term benefit as part of a broader lifestyle pattern. The ancient texts do not leave this to speculation. The Song of Solomon describes honey under the tongue of the beloved. 1 Samuel chapter 14 tells the striking story of Jonathan dipping his staff into a honeycomb and becoming visibly refreshed, his eyes brightening in the field of Michmash. Biblical scholars have long debated whether this was bee honey or date honey, and the honest answer is that the ancient Hebrew word blurred that distinction deliberately, because both sweet substances were understood as gifts of the land. But the sheer volume of date palms in the region and the archaeological evidence of date syrup production vessels found in sites from Masada to Ein Gedi strongly suggests that date honey was the more common form in daily life. Josephus wrote of the palm groves around Jericho producing a honey scarcely inferior to the honey of bees and at a fraction of the labor. So how do you use this in a modern kitchen? The simplest application is a direct swap, where a recipe calls for honey, maple syrup, or refined sugar. Substitute date syrup in a roughly 1-to-1 ratio, though you may want to reduce slightly, because date syrup tends to be marginally sweeter. Stir a teaspoon into plain Greek yogurt with walnuts for a breakfast that echoes the shepherd's meal of ancient Canaan. Drizzle it over oatmeal cooked with cinnamon. Whisk it into salad dressings with olive oil and lemon juice and a pinch of salt. Use it as a glaze for roasted carrots or sweet potatoes, brushing it on during the last 5 minutes of roasting at 200 degrees Celsius so the sugars caramelize without burning. Stir it into warm milk at bedtime with a touch of turmeric. Dissolve it into coffee or herbal tea where you would normally reach for refined sugar. The applications are endless, and every one of them replaces a refined sweetener with something that carries centuries of nutritional wisdom embedded in its molecular structure. There is one more research note worth sharing. A 2020 paper in the journal Food Chemistry examined the antioxidant capacity of various natural sweeteners using the ORAC and DPPH assays two standard laboratory methods for measuring a food's ability to neutralize free radicals. Date syrup scored 3 to 5 times higher than raw honey and roughly 7 times higher than maple syrup in certain measurements. Refined white sugar scored essentially 0. The authors noted that the specific polyphenolic profile of date syrup, including its tannins, was the principal driver of this antioxidant activity. Again, the point is not that date syrup is a medicine. The point is that the food you choose as your daily sweetener carries consequences over years and decades, and the ancient Judeans seem to have chosen wisely. There is also the matter of how date syrup interacts with the gut microbiome, which modern research is only beginning to map. The soluble fiber fraction in authentic psylin, particularly the arabinogalactan and pectin components, functions as a prebiotic. A study in the International Journal of Food Sciences and Nutrition in 2018 reported that date-based products fostered the growth of beneficial bifidobacterium and lactobacillus strains in laboratory fermentation models. The ancients described it more simply. They said, date syrup soothed the belly and calmed the spirit. Rabbinical commentaries from the Talmudic period mention date honey as a food suitable for the elderly, for the sick, and for children, precisely because its sweetness carried with it something more than mere calories. It carried fiber, minerals, and that unnamed something that modern science now identifies as a living ecosystem of prebiotic activity. Consider also the role of date syrup in the agricultural calendar of ancient Israel. The date harvest came in late summer, typically August and September, when the fruits hung heavy and amber on the fronds. Families would gather the dates, lay them out on woven mats to dry in the sun, then press and boil the surplus into syrup that would carry them through the winter. This was food preservation at its most elegant. The sugars and the natural acids in the syrup prevented microbial growth, allowing a single harvest to sustain a household for an entire year. Compare this to the modern industrial food system, which requires refrigeration, preservatives, plastic packaging, and long supply chains to accomplish what a clay jar of psylin did in a cool pantry for 3,000 years. The ancient technology was better in ways we are only now beginning to appreciate, and there is a deeper wisdom embedded in how date syrup is traditionally consumed. The ancient households did not pour it freely the way modern households pour high-fructose corn syrup. They used it sparingly, reverently, a drizzle here and a spoonful there, understanding instinctively that concentrated sweetness was a gift to be respected rather than a commodity to be abused. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition has published multiple papers since the late 1990s, documenting the metabolic consequences of excessive sweetener consumption regardless of source. Moderation matters. Portion matters. Pattern matters. Switching from refined sugar to date syrup is not an invitation to double your intake. It is an invitation to return to a more honored relationship with sweetness itself. One spoonful, one bread, one meal at a time. Your body is described in 1 Corinthians 6:19 as a temple of the Holy Spirit, and every spoonful of what you put into it is either reverence or disregard for that dwelling place. The modern grocery store offers 40 varieties of sugary sweetener, most of them engineered in laboratories, stripped of everything nutritionally meaningful, and blended with additives your great-grandmother would not have recognized. The biblical alternative is quieter, older, and still available. A jar of authentic psylin, made from dates grown under the same sun that warmed the hills where the prophets walked, reduced gently over low heat, in the same way it has been made for 3,000 years. It is the sweetness of the promised land, and it has been waiting on grocery shelves for anyone willing to look past the bright labels of the industrial food aisle. The concrete first step is the simplest one. Find a reputable small producer date syrup. One ingredient, Dates only, minimally processed. Replace one sweetener in your home with it this week. Perhaps the honey in your tea. Perhaps the sugar in your morning oatmeal. Perhaps the maple syrup on your weekend pancakes. Use it for 30 days and see how your body responds. Notice your energy patterns. Notice your sleep. Notice the way the flavor teaches you to appreciate a sweetness that is complex rather than flat, deep rather than sharp. And if you find it as transformative as countless households across the Middle East have found it for 3 millennia, consider sharing this wisdom with someone else who is trying to step away from refined sugar. Leave a comment below and tell me which recipe you tried first, because I read every single one. And the conversations in the comment section of this channel have become one of the most faithful, thoughtful communities I know of. If this teaching blessed you, pass it along to one friend today, someone you love, someone you pray for. Until next time, stay in the Word, stay in the kitchen, and remember that the land flowing with milk and honey was not a metaphor. It was a map.